But let me pause now and ask if there are questions or comments that you would like to make.
Dr. Carson, you mentioned about in your third point that or sin in its relationship to suffering and death. Would you like to elaborate more on the relationship between the gospel and sickness and disease, and how do we address it?
Would you allow me to answer that one in the second hour? In this first hour, I was dealing with laying out the problem. I think that it's demonstrable in Scripture. But how the gospel addresses that, I prefer to wait for the second hour. So I've managed to duck the first question. Next. If you're not satisfied, make sure that you raise the question again in the second hour. There's a hand here.
Professor Carson, in your third point, you said that death was not supposed to be.
Yes.
How do you square that with a statement in Romans, for instance, where Paul says that he causes all men to be disobedient, that he may have mercy on all?
Yes. It's a good question, but let me clarify what I meant. What I was saying was not addressing the question of God's sovereignty. I insist upon it. And in that sense, God is sovereign over all that takes place. But God does not stand behind good and evil symmetrically. The Bible insists that God is unequivocally, univocally, inevitably good and only good, as James 1:13 puts it. In him there's no darkness at all. He's only good. So when the Bible presents God as being sovereign over all things, so that nothing, including evil and death, take place outside the sphere of God's sovereignty, it's one of the entailments of having a sovereign God as sovereign over the whole thing, then at certain levels you have to say God stands behind it, but in such a way that he may actually oppose it, because he does not stand behind good and evil exactly the same way. That's why the same God who says, for example, that he raises up nations and puts them down. He even raised up Pharaoh in order that his judgment might be manifested and things like that. He's also the God who can say, turn, turn, why will you die? The Lord has no pleasure in the death of the wicked. So insofar as death is demonstrably the result of sin, then you want to say that the God of the Bible presents himself in this remarkable way of being, in one sense, sovereign over all things, including the fall, but nevertheless standing behind good and evil so asymmetrically that he's outraged by sin. It's part of the givenness of who God is. And in that sense, you want to say it's not the direct result of God's effective acting. He stands behind good and evil asymmetrically. The good is always creditable to him. The evil is regularly creditable to secondary causalities, even though it cannot escape the outermost sphere of his sovereignty. It's in that sense that if you pushed me, I would qualify the statement but still defend it.
So in that hypothesis, would you come on to say that evil was a theological construct that he created?
No, it's not a theological construct, nor is it a thing. It's not a thing that he created. The Bible never speaks of God creating evil. It speaks of God's being sovereign over good things, and in Hebrew that is wretched things, evil things. So his sovereignty is never abrogated. But it's not as if God stands behind good and evil so symmetrically that he becomes an amoral God. The same scriptures that insist that God is absolutely sovereign also insist that God is absolutely good. And those are part of the givens to begin with. So that when you create a structure of thought adequate for beginning to account for some of this, then you deal with certain texts. Let me mention, this one's an important enough question. Would you give me a minute or two to answer this one a little longer? Consider, for example, this passage from Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 10. And there are dozens and dozens and dozens of passages like this. Isaiah chapter 10, beginning at verse 5. God says through the prophet, woe to the Assyrian. Assyria was the regional superpower of the day and pretty barbarous in its military prowess. Woe to the Assyrian, the rod of my anger, in whose hand is the club of my wrath. I send him against a godless nation. So here God is saying that he's sending the Assyrians, who are pagans, against the godly nation, namely the Israelites, to chasten them. So God is sending the barbarian Assyrians against the godless nation, his own covenant people. I send him against a godless nation. I dispatch him against a people who anger me, to seize loot and snatch plunder, and to trample them down like mud in the streets. In that sense, God is behind the Assyrian. But, verse 7, this is not what he intends. That is, the Assyrian intends. This is not what he has in mind. His purpose is to destroy, to put an end to many nations. Are not my commanders all kings? He says, that is, even my commanders are like the kings of other countries. I'm that powerful. Has not Calno fared like Carchemish? Is not Hamath like Arpad, and Samaria like Damascus? All cities that he's already beaten up, that he's already taken over. Shall I not deal with Jerusalem and her images? Verse 11, as I dealt with Samaria and her idols. Verse 12, Isaiah says, when the Lord has finished all his work against Mount Zion and Jerusalem, that is, his work in using the Assyrians to chasten them, he will say, I will now punish the king of Assyria for the willful pride of his heart and the haughty look in his eyes. For he says, by the strength of my hand I have done this, and by my wisdom, because I have understanding. I removed the boundaries of nations. I plundered their treasures. Like a mighty one I subdued their kings. As one reaches into a nest, so my hand reached for the wealth of the nations. As people gather abandoned eggs, so I gathered all the countries. Not one flapped a wing or opened its mouth to chirp. And God says, does the axe raise itself above the person who swings it? Or the saw boast against the one who uses it? That is, from one perspective, the mighty Assyrian army is nothing more than a tool in God's hand. And for the Assyrians to think that they're doing it all on their own is already itself wicked and blasphemous. Therefore, verse 16, the Lord Almighty will send a wasting disease upon his sturdy warriors. Under the pomp of fire will be kindled like a blazing flame, and so on and so on. Do you see? Now, what you get from a passage like this, it seems to me, are two truths that you can illustrate again and again and again and again in Scripture. Number one, God is absolutely sovereign. But his sovereignty never functions in such a way as to mitigate human responsibility. He still holds the Assyrians responsible. Number two, human beings are morally responsible creatures. That is, they believe, they disbelieve, they obey, they disobey, they do good things, they do bad things. They are morally responsible creatures. They do these things and they're held accountable for it. But though they are morally responsible creatures, they never, ever succeed in making God absolutely contingent. He remains sovereign yet. Now, those two truths, it seems to me, in Scripture are givens. By and large, they're not argued for. They're presupposed. And they surface again and again and again. They surface, as I indicated last night in the Q&A session, they surface in the cross. Read Acts 4:27 and 28. Did not Pilate and Herod and the rulers of the Jews conspire against your holy servant Jesus? They did what your hand had determined beforehand should be done. And they're both true. God's sovereignty in the cross does not mean that Pilate has the right to wash his hands. And so the same thing is true, it seems to me, in these broader structures when you're starting to talk about sin and death and their origins and so on. Evil is not presented as a chunk of something that God created the way he created a solar system. It is presented as rebellion, anarchy of morally sensible creatures who rebel against the God who made them and to whom they must give an account, but even their rebellion is not unforeseen by God. It never manages to step outside the outermost bounds of his sovereignty. But God rules in such a way that he can be utterly opposed to it and still insist it's not the way it's supposed to be. Death must die. And he sends his own son ultimately to kill death. That's the whole point of 1 Corinthians 15. Now, it's within that kind of larger theological framework, it seems to me, that you've got to speak about these things. Does that help?
Professor Carson, in the context of evangelistic preaching, with your emphasis on saying God's view of the problem and God's view of the solution, assuming that there would be atheists among the people you're addressing, wouldn't it be necessary first to establish the existence of God before talking about then God's view of the problem?
Brilliant question, which I will reserve for the next hour. No, it's exactly the next question to go to. That's exactly right. But I'll be coming to the solution pretty soon. So let me bring it up again there. And if you're not satisfied with my answer, then at the next Q&A, bring it up again. Sir.
Dr. Carson, how do you explain Romans 8, where Paul speaks about the creation itself groaning with us and is subject to decay and corruption? Now, did this decay and corruption come after the fall, or was it before?
It's after. It's after.
If it is after, there was death and so on before the fall of man in the animal world and perhaps in pre-Adamic kind of man, or whatever. How do we explain that?
That depends on quite a lot on how you put together the Genesis narrative. In other words, although most sides will agree today that there is some degree of symbol-ladenness in the Genesis 1 to 11 accounts. If you were here last night, you heard some of the way I handled texts like they were naked and not ashamed, and so on, so on, so on. I would be prepared to argue that there are 2 or 3 immutables that are pretty hard to duck if you're going to be faithful to Scripture. One of them is that all of human beings descended from one pair. Because you're not just dealing with the account in Genesis with a superfluity of symbol-laden language. You're also dealing with things like the argument of Paul in Romans 5 and 1 Corinthians 15. You're also dealing with a genealogy in Luke's Gospel, which, despite many, many gaps, goes back all the way to Adam and so on. In other words, there is an assumption that however you put the pieces together, human beings descend from one pair. It's picked up to make a theological judgment in Paul's address, for example, to the Athenians. The second thing that is unambiguous, it seems to me, about Genesis 3 is that the fall introduces death. Now, people might argue a bit about whether that means human death or the death, introducing death into a pristine world which was a precursor to a new heaven and a new earth where the wolf lies down with a lamb and a child plays over an asp's hole and a little child shall lead bears and all that kind of thing. They shall not hurt or destroy on all my holy mountain. The question at that point becomes, was there a pre-Adamic world that was only good? And Christians have sometimes disagreed about just the nature of how you put all of those pieces together. I'm happy to talk about them if you give me about 20 hours. On the other hand, what I do want to say is that there are certain immutable things, and one of the things is the multifaceted nature of death amongst human beings that is introduced by the fall, and with it the curse upon creation, the whole created order. Last question.
Thank you,
We are
Dr.
breathless
Carson.
with anticipation.
So just now in the first part of the talk, you present the sin in different dimensions, in 5 different aspects. Relation with God, the transgression of the law, another aspect. So in our presentation of the gospel, when we address different people, are we going to present the nature of sin in all their aspects, or should we just present certain aspects towards different group of people?
That's a very good question. I indicated something of it on the way by, and I'm going to be addressing it more closely in the next hour, but let me say this much. I do not think that you should try to present all that the Bible has to say about sin to unbelievers in every sermon. For a start, it's going to be a very long sermon. And moreover, so many of the categories are going to be so alien that it takes a while to build up the kind of rapport and connection to get them across. On the other hand, I would say that if you are preaching regularly to unbelievers, your aim over time, not least in the context of regular church ministry, is to get across all of these facets of sin. You don't have the right arbitrarily to choose one and never to say anything else about all the rest. Where then becomes your commitment to preach the whole counsel of God? And what we'll see in the second hour is that unless you have such commitments, you will end up with a reduced view of the gospel as well. You will choose that view of sin that seems most compatible with your particular subculture, and then that view of the gospel which seems most appreciated by your view of the gospel, in which case the Bible itself is not in any sense powerfully standing over against your culture. Whereas what you discover on the long haul is that faithful biblical teaching of the whole counsel of God will confront every culture. But it may confront every culture in slightly different ways, with slightly different emphases. And your job as a Christian preacher is to teach and preach the whole counsel of God.